Hi, everyone. So thank you for joining us and welcome to the UCL Friends of MSF panel about COVID-19 inequalities. So I think we can start now by just a really quick introductory presentation whilst we wait for just a few more people to join. So I'm Marie, and together with Aisha, who has her video on right now, we will be helping to moderate this event. And yeah, so again, I'm going to start by a quick presentation just to run through how the event is going to go before we actually start with our presentations. So here's the plan for today. We are very lucky to have 5 speakers from all over the world joining us. Some are here very late at night and in different time zones in India and the US. So thank you very much to all the speakers for making time for us. And to the participants who have joined us, make sure to stay until the end for the opportunity to ask our panel your questions. But before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. So we ask that you keep your microphones off throughout the talks. And in between each talk and at the Q&A session in the end, you're always welcome to put your cameras on if you want to, but just bear in mind that this event is recorded. And also, if you would like to ask a question throughout the events, please post them on this website, slido.com or sly.do, with the event code number 64222. You can post your questions anonymously and upvote the ones you find interesting. So this will be posted again in the chat, so don't worry about it now. Don't worry about it too much. And yeah, so now that it's 5:05, I think we can start by introducing our first speaker, if she is here. Can you guys confirm that she is here?
Yeah, I'm here. Hello.
Oh, okay. Hi. Thank you very much. So we're very lucky to have our first speaker here with us. Scourse is a policy advisor at the MSF Access Campaign with a lot of experience advocating for fair access to healthcare services and medical tools, including vaccines. Her work includes monitoring affordability, supply, allocation, and sharing of data and knowledge to ensure that everyone can have better access to healthcare. And this has positively impacted people living in marginalized communities and in countries where MSF works. So I'm sure we're all very excited to hear from you. So I'll unshare my screen and let you take over. Thank you.
Okay, so I should share my screen, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. So hopefully this works.
Yeah, that's great.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
I'll just make it full screen. Okay, cool. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here and you know, on a great panel. Yeah, as you said, I'm Ros Scourse. I'm policy advisor for the MSF Mèdicins Sans Frontières Access Campaign, and I'm based in the UK. So I follow the Access Campaign's work, which I will introduce in a second and talk about predominantly through a UK policy lens and the impact, the broader kind of impact on global access, particularly for the places where MSF works, but also beyond. So just briefly, quickly, before I get into the work of the Access Campaign, just to say that MSF obviously is an international humanitarian organisation responding to humanitarian crises in over 70 countries. In responding to COVID, we're also working in over 60 countries now, and this has, you know, unprecedentedly for the first time included MSF working in countries like the US, the UK, Switzerland, Germany, and other EU countries because of the scale of the pandemic in these countries. MSF's response generally has been in 5 key areas. So protecting vulnerable people, particularly people living in camps and overcrowded conditions, but also homeless populations, including in the UK. Maintaining essential existing healthcare programs, so that is far-reaching, can include maternity units, but also TB programs and just existing services that we have, many of which have been very impacted by the pandemic. Protecting our own healthcare workers, but also beyond, and including access to personal protective equipment, which obviously, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, was very challenging. Protecting those most at risk, obviously the highest risk populations, and that does also include healthcare workers, and obviously access to COVID-19 medical tools, and that includes tests, treatments, and vaccines. And this is the fifth bucket, is kind of particularly where the Access campaign and my work is focused. So just to give a background on the work of the Access campaign and why MSF have an Access campaign, because obviously when most people think about MSF, they think about the medical humanitarian work that we do, which is obviously the vast majority of our work. But we also have something called an Access campaign, which sits in the international office, which essentially fights for equitable access to essential life-saving health products for MSF, but also beyond. And the reason that we have an Access campaign, which is very, very pertinent now that we are looking at the fight for equitable access to COVID products, is because basically back in 1999, when the Access campaign was founded, MSF medical staff, doctors and nurses, were frustrated because many of the products that they needed to treat their patients with various conditions were either unavailable, unaffordable, or unsuitable. And I'll talk a bit about what I mean by those and why they're relevant for COVID in a second. So the Access campaign was launched when MSF won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. And they said that, life-saving medical products were either too expensive, they were not available because they basically weren't developed, because the diseases that they needed to have treatments for were not seen as financially viable. They were not profitable, essentially. And because there was basically no research and development for certain neglected tropical diseases, because again, they were not a profitable market. And so this kind of bigger picture of the failure of the system to prioritize health needs over what was profitable was called a market failure. And what MSF did was launch the Access campaign to look at these systemic challenges in access to life-saving medical products, and said, at the bottom here, what we need is change, not charity. So it's not about demanding for donations from the pharmaceutical industry, for example, but about fighting for broader system change. And that's why many of these issues have become so pertinent again within COVID. So in terms of what I meant by those three buckets that I just mentioned earlier, the first one being affordability. This graph basically shows some of the challenges that we faced during the HIV crisis, where basically the highest price initially for some ARVs per patient per year was over £10,000. And so, obviously this price hindered access basically for many people living with HIV, particularly in low middle income countries. Whereas it also shows what happens when you basically have more than one manufacturer coming online. So basically it shows what happens when you have generic competition. So basically it's showing that if you have only one company producing a product, you get very high prices. If you have lots of companies producing a product, it brings the price down. So this is just showing what happens when you have more than one company producing a product. And this is very pertinent and relevant later when I talk about COVID vaccines and why we need more than one supplier. So you basically need competition in the market so that we have lower prices. Another example of affordability barriers was a hepatitis C drug, which was called sofosbuvir, which basically was $1,000 per pill. And gram for gram, this is more expensive than gold, or 67 times more expensive than gold. So these are just a couple of examples of extortionately highly priced medical products that we have worked on previously that illustrate the example of unaffordable health products. The second bucket is products that are unavailable. So they basically don't exist because they're not, a treatment for a certain disease doesn't exist because it's not seen as financially viable. It's not a priority for pharmaceutical industry to do research and development into because they're not going to make a profit. And one of those areas is antimicrobial resistance, which obviously we all probably heard a lot about, is a huge challenge. And basically what this image is showing is that we basically have a discovery void since the late 1980s, where basically a lot of pharmaceutical companies and research and development into antibiotics basically stopped or massively decreased because it's not a financially viable market for a profit-driven industry. So that part of the reason for that is because when you develop a new antibiotic, you need to be careful about how it's used. You don't want to overuse it because obviously you end up in a situation where you get resistance to it again if it's overused. So you have to have something called stewardship. And so if you limit the amount you can use a product, obviously you can't push sales as much as you might like to. It wouldn't be as profitable as you might hope it to be. And so it's not a profitable industry. And so this is partly why we have a crisis now of lack of antibiotics and antimicrobial resistance because of the discovery void that we have seen in the last few decades. In relation to COVID, the lack of available treatments and products is very relevant as well, because if we look at what we've done in terms of pandemic preparedness, there's been many scientists and research institutions, not least Oxford University and others, who are looking at coronavirus research for many years as publicly funded research institutions. But many of them have spoken out about the fact that they really struggle to get funding or financing or even pharmaceutical industry partners to work on their vaccine candidates with. And part of the reason for that is obviously pre-pandemic, there was no incentive or profit-driven incentive for a pharmaceutical industry to get involved in the R&D for a coronavirus vaccine because obviously there was no demand and so it wasn't profitable enough. So the pandemic preparedness element is not considered because obviously at the time it wasn't profitable, which meant that obviously we've been much less well prepared than we could have been for the coronavirus pandemic, despite many warning signs that this was likely to be the next big pandemic. So then just in terms of products that are unsuitable, this is an example of, for example, products that are developed by the pharmaceutical industry without key populations or target populations in mind. And this has also happened with the coronavirus vaccines. But we saw it first. Well, a very key example is the Ebola vaccine, which obviously for the crisis outbreak in DRC, basically when we needed to have access to the Ebola vaccine, which firstly sat on a shelf in a Canadian research institute for many years because there was no financial incentive for the pharmaceutical industry to develop the vaccine. Once it was developed, it had to be stored at -60 to -80 degrees centigrade in the same way that some of the COVID vaccines have to be kept. But obviously this is a massive challenge for getting this vaccine to these populations. MSF was really involved in the rollout of the Ebola vaccine in DRC. And it's a massive challenge to try and get a vaccine at these temperatures to these populations that are very rural, and obviously is not such a challenge in high-income countries. So now you can see many high-income countries are starting to roll out the Pfizer COVID vaccine, for example, which requires this cold chain. For example, in the UK, we're using it. But many low and middle-income countries have said, actually, it's not possible for us to use that vaccine candidate because we haven't got the capacity to do that cold chain requirement. And so it basically is the research and development is also not designed in a way that considers key populations or populations in low and middle income countries. Another example is TB, which was actually the world's largest infectious disease killer before COVID. So last year was actually taken over by COVID as the largest infectious disease killer. But before that, TB kills millions of people every year, despite the fact that many people, particularly in high-income countries, no longer consider it a huge challenge. But it is, and there are the drugs to treat it, particularly drug-resistant TB, are very unsuitable, and the side effects can be awful. So for example, this is a picture of Fumeza, who's done some campaigning with us, who basically went permanently deaf as a result of her treatment. And so it just shows that, you know, if TB affected this many people in rich countries or in a profitable market, then obviously we wouldn't have such underdeveloped or under-prioritized areas of health. But it shows how this profit-driven system that we have does not prioritize the most critical health needs. So we have two models for innovation, basically, for research and development innovation. We have a monopoly model, which we currently have now, which obviously prioritizes profit, where you have high amounts of public funding, and collaboration and data sharing are discouraged, because obviously we have a system where when a company develops a new product, they patent it. When you patent a product, you get a 20-year monopoly. And so what that monopoly means is that no other manufacturers are able to produce that product for a period of 20 years at least. And so you don't have collaboration, you don't have data sharing, you have this monopoly-driven model where the lack of multiple suppliers in the market means that there's very high prices, and it also limits supplies, which obviously during a pandemic right now is a huge issue. Whereas we want to move towards a needs-driven model where basically public health needs are setting priorities globally. We have open collaboration and data sharing. And so that basically what this would mean is that, you know, health is prioritized, we'd have fairer prices, you'd have more manufacturers, you'd have increased supply, and you'd also have more progress because you're allowed to collaborate and share data and knowledge. So just all that to say that, you know, COVID is basically putting a spotlight on many of these challenges that we have seen for many years. So the lack of financial investment, like I mentioned, pharmaceutical monopolies, which leads to high prices and limited supplies, and the lack of suitability. So what all these challenges mean is that you basically have global inequities in access to life-saving vaccines, treatments and diagnostics, and that high-income countries essentially, you know, the needs of high-income countries get prioritized, and they often get access before low and middle income countries. This graph illustrates that very clearly. So what this graph shows basically is when people living with HIV in the US got access to ARVs compared to people living with HIV in Africa. And you can see that from basically the mid-90s, populations in the US, people started to get access to treatment, whereas people living in Africa didn't get that until mid-2000s. There was a 10-year lag, basically, between when people in the US got access and when people in Africa got access, even though these treatments existed. So people were dying despite there being treatments that existed that could have saved their lives. And that lag led to 12 million extra deaths of people in Africa that could have been avoided if they could have had access to treatment. So this is a scenario that we want to avoid in COVID, but is exactly the scenario that is now playing out with COVID vaccines. So this is a graph showing, but it's slightly out of date. I mean, I think Canada's now overtaken the UK, actually, but basically showing which countries have pre-ordered the most vaccines for COVID per person. So you can see the UK, US, EU, basically richer countries have hoarded the most, whereas lower middle income countries, which if you look right at the bottom of the graph, it says LMICs, so lower middle income countries, have got very few. And so you basically have a situation where pharmaceutical companies will sell their COVID vaccines to governments that can pay the most. And that leaves low and middle income countries behind. So we're going to, you know, we risk seeing the same scenario playing out again. Okay, this is the graph showing Canada's overtaken. So yeah, I mean, Canada's bought up a huge amount of vaccines now. as have the rest of these countries. And now, and I mean, at one point, I mean, maybe last month, it was estimated that wealthy countries representing just 14% of the world's population have bought up more than 50% of the world's vaccine supply. And so this is not equitable access. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we said there needs to be equitable access. And what that means is that high-risk people everywhere get access first. Healthcare workers everywhere get access first. But that's not what we're seeing now. What we're seeing is countries who could pay the most are getting access first. So, you know, one of the leading causes of that is pharmaceutical company monopolies, not least because we have limited available supplies. So you will have seen in the news today, but, you know, over the last few weeks and months, there is not enough COVID vaccines to go around. The EU and the UK are fighting over who gets access first. You know, without even thinking about the fact that, you know, the majority actually of lower middle income countries have not even started vaccinating anyone yet. And so we have a situation where, you know, rich countries, for example, the UK, are starting to vaccinate low risk people before very high risk people or healthcare workers in many lower middle income countries have started being vaccinated. So that is not an equitable access model. In addition to the supply issues, we're also seeing high prices from some companies, obviously not all, but a number of countries, including Pfizer and Moderna, have made it very clear that they will make significant profits from their COVID vaccines. So because, you know, because of the experience that the MSF Access campaign have had on a number of other health issues over the years, one of the things that we called for quite early in the pandemic, back, you know, in March time last year, was that there should be no patents and no profiteering from the pandemic. And so what we mean by no patents is no intellectual property rights on COVID, you know, tests, but also drugs, treatments, vaccines, so that we don't limit that available supply, but also so that we can keep prices down. Since then, there has actually been a proposal at the World Trade Organization put forward by South Africa, India, and a number of other countries, now supported by nearly 100 countries, to have a waiver on intellectual property rights, including patents, on COVID medical technologies until the world has global herd immunity. So they proposed this at the World Trade Organization because the World Trade Organization is basically where oversees intellectual property rights globally and those negotiations between countries. And what these countries are proposing is that this waiver on intellectual property rights on these products would maximize available global supplies, including enabling manufacturers in their own countries to start producing these products. It would bring down prices because you'd have more manufacturers, and it would therefore increase global equitable access, because basically, instead of saying it has to be a choice between someone in the UK getting vaccinated and someone in South Africa, we want to be able to say there's enough for everybody. But the situation we're having right now is fighting over available supplies, when actually the problem is pharmaceutical company monopolies. And so this is what these countries are putting forward. So important to note that this is related to vaccines, but it's not limited to vaccines. It would also be a waiver on IP rights for tests, treatments, but also things like personal protective equipment, ventilators, lots of critical medical products that we need to scale up production of. So this is a pretty landmark proposal. Hundreds of countries and civil society organizations, academics, economists around the world are now really pushing and supporting this proposal, including from UCL. Actually, we have a number of academics who supported a recent letter to the government on this. And you can see from this graph that there's a significant north-south divide in which countries support and which countries oppose this proposal. So, for example, you can see that the UK, the majority of EU countries, the US oppose the proposal, whereas all the yellow countries are co-sponsors, so strong supporters, and the green ones are supporters. So you can see there's a strong north-south divide. So basically, all the countries that have a strong pharmaceutical company presence in them, and therefore strong pharmaceutical company lobby, are opposing it, to be honest. And many of the countries in the global south, low and middle income countries, who want to be able to have the ability to start producing these products for their own populations, are supporting the proposal, but are being blocked by mostly by high income countries who already have access to these products. So in the UK context, the government's opposing the waiver. This is their statement, if you're interested to read their statement. But at the same time as opposing this waiver, or basically opposing the ability of other countries to start producing their own COVID products, they are also one of the worst for vaccine nationalism and hoarding. So basically they're hoarding far more vaccines than they actually need for our population. We have, I think, more than 4 times enough vaccines for the whole, more than 4 times the population that we need of vaccine doses in the UK. So we have far more than we will need. But at the same time, they're opposing this for other countries. They put a huge amount of public funding, so over £1 billion into the research and development of COVID-19 technologies. Sorry, my daughter's just got home, walked through. So what we're saying to them is that, you know, if you're putting this huge amount of public funding into these products alongside other governments, so the 6 front-runner vaccine candidates have actually received more than £7 billion of public funding. And so what we're saying is that that should then therefore not become the property of pharmaceutical companies and should be available for all. They're apparently committed to equitable access, so they've put a lot of money into the COVAX advanced market commitment, which you might have heard of, is a kind of mechanism to increase access for low and middle income countries. But there are not enough actual doses for the COVAX mechanism to buy for low and middle income countries. And so if there's no products to buy, then obviously putting money in doesn't help the situation. What we need to do is increase the overall pie of vaccine supply so that there's enough for all. And obviously they have a large pharmaceutical company presence and lobby, which is having a big impact on their position. So there's been a number of actions in the UK related to this. Obviously, we've written letters to the government from civil society organisations, from MSF. There's been a debate in Parliament about it, where prominent Labour MPs, for example, Lisa Nandy and others, have spoken up about it. There's an early day motion currently in Parliament that we're encouraging MPs to sign on to. And obviously, MSF have done a number of actions, including we have a petition on our site at the moment, encouraging people to write to their MP to get them to support the motion. So just finally, a couple of things that you can do as students or as academics or just as people, anyone living in the UK. You can write to your MP to ask them to support this motion. So there's the action on our website. Obviously, this can be shared within the university. And like I mentioned, there's a number of academics at UCL who have supported us with some letters on this to the government. You could write a blog if you're particularly interested in this as a student. We have a Medium page as the Access campaign. A number of students have written blogs for us there. And we're really interested in getting some local coverage. So for your local newspaper or contacting your local MP to do something with them to get a bit more kind of local coverage. And obviously, as a Friends for MSF society, you can organise or join actions and activities on this as Friends of MSF, or you can also connect with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which is another society that many of you might have heard of, who do a lot of campaigning on these issues already. And I don't know how active they are in UCL actually, but would be worth connecting with them. So I think that's my time, but I'm happy to take questions now or later, whenever is best for the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, we were just going to ask participants to put the questions in a website that we're going to put in the chat box for later. So yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting to see how complex accessibility to healthcare is and how it involves so many socioeconomic and political factors. So I'm going to let Aisha introduce our next speaker, and I'll put the question link in the chats.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Professor Benny Chain, who is a professor of immunology at the UCL Division of Infection and Immunity. He has done extensive research on the immune response to cancer and viruses, with a particular focus on T and B cell repertoire diversity. Moreover, he has an interest in computational immunology, incorporating mathematics and computer science with medicine to better understand the vast quantity of immunological data. And today he'll be speaking about the immunology of COVID. So please stay tuned, and I'd like to hand over to him now. If you'd like to share your screen. Thank you.
Great. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Aisha, for the introduction, and thank you to your committee for inviting me. Looks like a really interesting. I've already learned a lot that I didn't know, and I'm sure I will learn more as the evening goes on. So my brief was to try and very briefly sort of give some of the basic fundamental science around COVID-19, and particularly the immune response to it, and how the vaccines are believed to be working. So that's what I'm going to try and do in just a few slides. If I just so just a very brief general virological introduction. COVID-19 is part of a very large family, as many of you know, of coronaviruses. Many of these viruses are actually avian viruses. They're principally found in birds, but some of the families infect mammals routinely, and SARS-CoV-2 is among those. I'll sort of interchangeably use SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, and there's still some debate about exactly how the virus crossed species to enter the human, whether it's from bats or potentially from these pangolin animals that are eaten in some parts of the world, and probably we will never have a very definitive answer about that, but it's clearly been a very successful, from the virus point of view, zoonosis, an event of a virus switching species effectively. The virus is pretty infective. Fortunately, although the numbers are enormous, the actual infectivity of the virus is not as great as some other human viruses, presumably because there's had to be a large amount of adaptation to cross from whatever the species was into humans. But still, it's been very, from a virus point of view, a very successful virus in humans. And the real impact has been because, unlike many coronaviruses, it has a very serious pathology associated with it and a very high morbidity and mortality. So just can't have really, you'd have had to be burrowed in a deep hole not to have seen some picture of coronavirus in the last 12 months, but here it is. It's a very classical RNA-based envelope virus, so it has a membrane, and then inside it has an RNA genome, and the two key components I want to just bring to your attention, because they'll be the focus of the rest of this talk, are the membrane, the spike protein, which is in the membrane, in the outer membrane. So it's like a kind of upside down cone pointing out from the membrane. And here's a crystallographic picture of that protein, and you can see the binding domain at the end of it, which is how the virus latches on to the target cells in the lung via the ACE receptor and enters the cell. And the other end, as I say, is embedded in the membrane. And we'll see this is the main target for protective immunity, antibody immunity. There's been quite a lot of study of the internal nuclear capsid protein. This is the most abundant protein in the virus. After spike, I mean, it's the other major structural protein, and it's important because it's a very good marker for antibody responses. Even though they may not be protective, they're a very good way of indicating that the body has been infected by this virus. So just to point out that although it's an RNA virus, it really has quite a complicated genome. These are the open reading frames from this so far defined, and there's quite a lot of them. The function of many of these are still unknown, but they may play a role in perturbing the human immune response. And of course, because it's an RNA virus, when it replicates, the precision of the replicating machinery is less than the DNA viruses, and this gives rise to a certain mutation rate. The mutation rate is much, much smaller than, for example, HIV or other retroviruses or lentiviruses, but nevertheless significantly higher than other viruses, than say the big DNA viruses like herpes viruses and so on. And this has given rise to many variants already, and perhaps we can come back to that later. So another sort of couple of general points. I think this is a very important one in understanding the epidemic. So up here is shown a sort of a representation of what would happen. You get, let's say a person gets infected here, and then there's a period of incubation while the virus is growing predominantly in the respiratory tract, and then you get symptoms, and then you have symptoms for a while, and then they go away. And the key feature from a public health point of view is at what point in this cycle do you produce enough virus that it can be transmitted to another person down here? And you can imagine that this could happen late on in the infection once you've got symptoms up here, or it could happen very early on before you've got any symptoms. And this is key because if it happens when you're asymptomatic, it's extremely difficult, obviously, to prevent infection because the person doesn't know they're infected yet. Now you can learn this, the parameters of this epidemic, and for this particular virus, and I've quoted here just one paper. There have been several studies, but to summarize, first of all, the incubation period is shown here. It's around 3 days to a week between the time that you get infected and you show symptoms. Of course, it's a distribution, and one of the interesting features about this virus is that it varies enormously between individuals for reasons that we still don't fully understand. But the key thing I really want to focus on is here, the infectious virus. And you can see 0 is the time of symptoms onset. And you can see that the peak of virus is more or less simultaneous with the peak of symptoms, the first peak of symptoms. So this means, first of all, that there is several days before you become ill when you can transmit virus. And this has made sort of track and trace attempts very hard to do. But I'd like to also focus on another very important point, I think, from understanding the pathology of the disease. You can see that from the symptom point onwards, in general, virus loads starts to fall. Now, in the majority of people, and by the end of about a week post-infection, there's very little, if any, transmissible virus. You can still detect viral RNA by PCR, but any attempt to culture virus from those late time points has so far been unsuccessful. So there seems to be very little virus. Now, the vast majority of people also recover, and this red shows the disease, and they're fine, and then they go on to be perfectly healthy. But a minority of people, and it's quite a large minority in the case of COVID-19, carry on getting sicker. And in fact, they get sicker just as the viral load is falling. And they continue in some cases to get sicker and sicker until they eventually die, by which time there is really no virus at all in the body. This is a crucial thing in understanding COVID pathology, which we still don't fully understand, but it's quite clear that as in the case of many other infectious diseases, the pathology, the illness, is not driven by the virus itself, but almost certainly by the host response to the virus, by the immune response. And that's key. And it brings me to these two slides. Now, we're very familiar as infectious disease biologists or doctors with the idea that in many infections, immunity is a double-edged sword. The immune system is what protects us against infection. But in a huge number of infectious diseases, we heard a little bit about TB in the previous talk. It's the classic example. It's actually the immune system failing to get to grips or being somehow diverted or disrupted by the infection. It's the immune system which attacks us and ultimately causes the disease. That's certainly true for TB, and I think there's overwhelming evidence, partly from the sort of figures I just showed you, that that's true in COVID, although we don't know the exact mechanism, as we'll see in a minute. However, just bear in mind that if you look at it from the point of view of the virus, this is equally a double-edged sword. Obviously, the virus wants to avoid being protected against. It wants to avoid our immune system. But if you think about how COVID is transmitted from person to person, it's transmitted predominantly by droplet dispersion, which means that if you're coughing, spluttering, sneezing, all those things are exactly what causes the virus to move to another host and establish itself there. Those are, of course, part of the pathology themselves. And so for the virus, just as for the host, you have this double-edged sword. You want to replicate as fast as possible and avoid immune control by your host, but you need to stimulate enough immune response so as to stimulate the symptoms which help you jump to the new host. And you have to do it very fast because, as we see, this is a hit and run virus. It has a few days to multiply as fast as it can, to start you coughing, and then to push you into push himself into another host. So this double-edged sword is at the heart of the whole thing. Now, I just want to very briefly run through the three major branches of immunity that we recognize and how they all play a role in response to COVID-19. Let me first talk about innate immunity. This is immunity which is it's not learnt in the sense that a vaccine teaches the body to respond, but is sort of innate in all of us. And the key element here are these interferons, as their name gives them away. They are proteins produced in response to almost any virus which interfere with viral replication. That's why they were called interferons at the time. And there's strong evidence. This is a rather complicated figure. Don't worry too much about the details, but they show from our own work, and my colleague Madi Noor-Sadeghi, who's an infectious disease consultant and professor at UCL, who's been studying the transcriptomic response. So he takes a blood sample, blood samples from individuals who've been infected with COVID, and looks at which genes are being triggered by the virus. And they fall basically into two large groups. One of them is one group is a group of genes all concerned with cellular proliferation. So one of the effects of the virus is to stimulate the immune system to produce many cells. And we don't know exactly, but T cells are one of the major parts of this response. But the other major response is the interferon pathway. So this virus is not one of those that come by stealth. It doesn't try and avoid immune recognition. And in fact, it stimulates a very strong innate interferon response. And that is probably the main mechanism which leads to the viral clearance, which I showed you in the earlier slide. The fact that there is no virus by a week post symptoms is probably largely due to this. And we have some direct evidence from the work of Jean-Laurent Casanova, who has studied people. There's a small subgroup of people who have inborn errors in the interferon pathway, or who produce autoantibodies that block their own interferon. And those people are much higher risk of life-threatening disease. So interferons are a key element of early innate immunity, and they're a key part of how we respond to the virus. T cells, I'm not going to, it's actually my main interest, but I'm not going to spend very long on them at all. I'm not even going to explain in detail this figure, but each of these dots is a type of a T cell in the blood. And this counts the number of each type that you see in the blood of a patient, taken at the baseline, which was actually in this case at the very beginning of the first wave in the UK, as was a healthcare worker who we sampled as part of a big study at baseline. And this individual became positive for virus at week 1. This is week 0 here. And then we sampled him again at week 4. And you can see that there are some T cells which enormously proliferate. So they go from 0 in the blood, which probably means we just couldn't find them in that small sample of blood. They're certainly there, but absent in this sample, to thousands of times per million. So very frequent in the blood, just a couple of weeks after infection. So all I want to say really is that definitely there is a T cell response, and it's a very strong and early T cell response against COVID-19. But honestly, we don't really know to what extent those cells are important for protection, or to what extent they contribute to the pathology of the disease itself. And finally, let me say something about antibody, which of course is the major mode of protection for vaccines, and people are focused on antibodies against 2 components of the virus, this spike protein and this nucleocapsid protein. And you see here again from collaborators on our own study, you see here that there's a rather good correlation. This measures the amount of antibody against spike versus the ability of that antibody in the blood to neutralize the virus. In other words, to kill the virus by preventing it from entering the cell. The antibody binds to the edge of this molecule and stops it entering the cell. And you can see there's a very significant correlation, while as you'd expect, there's very little correlation to the internal proteins, which are not protective. So antibody against these is not protective because it can't cross the membrane of the virus, so it can never reach its target. Now, I think there's very little doubt that the antibody response is a major role in protection. It's the major role in protection by vaccines, but it probably plays a very important role also in protection against infection. You can see here that each of these rows is a healthcare worker that we sampled over time, and the more red that it is, the more antibody is found in the blood. And you can see in all these individuals, they started off as negative. Almost everyone, there's very few exceptions, who are infected by virus doesn't make a strong immune response against them, starting a couple of weeks later. And we know also from individuals who are immunocompromised, who may have some disease, so they cannot produce a good antibody response. Those people have great difficulty in clearing the virus. So this is really the dominant part, and this is why there's been all this interest in whether the virus can mutate to avoid the antibody response. So far, we're fortunate that although there have been some escape mutations, they've been only partial escapes, and the antibody produced by the vaccine is still largely neutralizing. So let me finish off by saying just a word about vaccines. It's quite incredible that in the just over a year really since the pandemic got underway, over 100 new vaccines have been developed and tested in all over the world, and they've covered every conceivable type of vaccine. I just want to say something about the main ones here. So we've already heard a little bit about the Pfizer and Moderna so-called RNA vaccines. This is really the very first time that a vaccine, so all the vaccines really have aimed to stimulate an antibody response against the spike protein. But normally vaccines work by taking the spike protein and injecting it into people and then getting the person to make an antibody response against them. That's how the common childhood vaccines all work. In the case of the RNA viruses, totally novel, you actually inject the RNA and then get the cells of the body to take up the RNA, produce the protein, and then make an antibody response. And there's no doubt that the efficacy of these vaccines has been really quite unexpectedly high. I must say I personally was rather skeptical and not very optimistic. Our track record of making good vaccines against respiratory infections has been extremely poor. Even TB, we don't really have a good vaccine for, and similarly flu. So it was really, I think we've been we sort of hit it lucky, if you can say anything lucky about the COVID pandemic, in the sense that it has proved quite susceptible to antibody protection. And I think it's possible that if these logistic problems about the stability of the vaccines can be solved, and they're sort of technical problems, that RNA vaccines may be here to stay. They're much easier in some senses to develop than the protein-based vaccines. The other type of vaccine, those of you who know a little bit about the history of vaccination will remember that when Jenner introduced his vaccines against smallpox, he was very fortunate that there was a virus called cowpox, which was sufficiently close to smallpox that he could use it to stimulate a cross-protective immune response. We don't have anything like that we know of for coronavirus, and probably we'd be too nervous to use it anyway. But we can now, by using the modern genetic engineering techniques, do one better. We can take a safe virus or a totally harmless virus like the monkey chimpanzee adenovirus that is the basis for the Oxford-based vaccine, or the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, and introduce the gene for the spike protein. And so you've sort of done what Jenner did in an artificial way. Again, these vaccines have had extraordinarily high efficacy. So that's good news. Whether these viruses, whether these live vaccines will continue to be used in the future, I think will depend on the competition in the market, and the main competition I think will come from very traditional vaccines, which are now just beginning to enter the market. They were slow and slower to develop than these new type of vaccines, but of course they have a huge track record of success in literally hundreds of millions of people over the last decades. These vaccines are now entering the clinic. They've been tested and they are also very efficient. So it remains to be seen whether these more experimental vaccines can maintain their place in the face of these relatively cheaply produced and very traditional approaches to vaccination. So just let me summarize. I think my time is up. In terms of protection against the vaccine, against coronavirus and particularly COVID-19, the key element is antibody against spike protein, but there's undoubtedly a very strong innate immune response, and that's probably responsible for the actual natural immunity that the vast majority of people show when they are infected and clear the virus. So that's very important part of the immune response. In terms of pathology, what's driving the disease, it's remarkable that we still know so little. I personally believe that the antibody response itself may be responsible in certain individuals, perhaps by the production of autoantibodies and complex formation, but that's probably a subject for a different lecture. I think it's really important to sort this out, because if we could actually cure people with coronavirus, then we wouldn't have to necessarily undergo these mass programs of vaccination, which are obviously logistic nightmares and enormously costly in a world setting. So I'll finish there, just to say that the actual work we've done has been supported by a fantastic team. And I'd like to just highlight Professor James Moon from Barts and Professor Madi Nusadeghi, who set up an amazing study very early on in the pandemic that's enabled us to get some real live, in real time data on this ongoing pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Chain. That was an amazing talk. Clearly, this pandemic has highlighted loads of problems and issues, but if there's any kind of silver lining to all of this, is the kind of progress, the masses of progress that has been made in research surrounding the virus, like you said, surrounding the vaccines as well. So thank you for that. And for the participants, for the audience, do kind of send your questions in using the Slido that Marie put into the chat. And I'll hand over to Marie now to introduce our next speaker.
So yeah, I just want to say thank you again to Professor Chain for speaking. It was very interesting. And we are also very grateful for our next speaker, coming all the way from India. So the time zone differences must be a bit tough for you. So I will introduce our next speaker now. So Dr. Gautam Hari Govind is an MSF doctor working currently with MSF's emergency intervention for COVID in Mumbai. On top of his work with MSF, he also has research and data management experience and is keen in promoting equal access to healthcare. So we're very excited to hear from your unique experience, and I will hand over to you now.
Sharing screen. Okay, you guys can see the slides. You can hear me as well?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gautam. I'm a primary care physician, and I have a background in clinical research and medical technologies for low resource settings. I work with MSF and have been part of their field activities in India since 2018. And currently I'm the medical team leader for the emergency intervention in Mumbai for COVID. So that's me, and that's a kid when I was working in rural India. What to expect? So when I was given the opportunity to speak at this event, I didn't know what I wanted to speak about. I'm still in the midst of the emergency intervention and have had very little time to reflect. This seemed like the perfect opportunity. And so what you can expect to hear is a narrative of a lived experience through the pandemic with stories and learnings using pictures and spoken word. I won't be using numbers or in-depth analysis because data was very strictly controlled by the MOH. They refused to share it with us. And so I don't really have any much analysis for you guys. But I hope you will learn something from this. That said, I'd like to start by setting the scene with the background and a day in the life. So when I was working in Patna, which is a city in central India, in an MSF advanced HIV project and palliative care project, when the pandemic hit, I was faced with a choice, and I decided that I wanted to work with patients who were infected with COVID. And so I moved to Mumbai, where MSF had planned an emergency intervention. Arrived in August during the monsoons and joined a team 1 month into their activities. I joined as a frontliner. This was when the first surge was just beginning. Our objective was to decongest tertiary hospitals through management of moderate cases using the high flow nasal cannula machine. We worked out of 2 wards in this very hospital. It was called the Shatabdi Hospital, which was converted into a dedicated COVID health center. And we had 5 HFNC machines at our disposal. This is what the machine looks like, and it's beautiful. The team comprised of medical doctors, specialists, and anesthesia technicians. 2 weeks in, Shatabdi decided that they would revert back to a non-COVID hospital and start catering to the other diseases that affected the health system. And so we had no place to work. We then decided to move to a jumbo COVID center, which was India's first makeshift hospital. It was set up in late May to serve as a dedicated transit hospital for mild and moderate COVID case management. It was a 1,000-bedded center, and in my opinion, an infrastructural marvel. 7 medical doctors, 4 specialists, 5 anesthesia technicians, and 5 HFNC machines entered the center on the 1st of September, when Mumbai was seeing on an average 2,200 cases per day. We were incorporated into their roster and began work immediately. There was no orientation, no welcome, no hi, no hello. I mean, I'm okay with that. I mean, how bad can it be? What followed was surreal, to say the least. Our doctors were placed in an area called the observation. This was the area with the highest footfall, where screening of patients, admissions, discharges, and transfers to higher center were handled. And we saw about 100 to 120 patients every 6-hour shift. My words may not be enough to capture what the observation looked like in the early days of the first wave, but let me try to describe a few aspects. It was a large rectangular space with an anteroom, 10 beds on one side where the sickest patients were placed while they waited for ICU beds to free up in tertiary centers or for ambulances to facilitate the transfer. 6 beds on the other side where new admissions were screened, categorized, and prepared to be shifted into the wards. And 1 bed, which was essentially the pharmacy. It had tablets, injectables, syringes, oxygen masks, and even doubled up as the crash cart. The anteroom was full of concerned relatives, ambulance drivers bringing patients in from other hospitals, new patients awaiting their turn to be seen by somebody, discharged patients waiting for somebody from their family to come and get them, and 2 completely overwhelmed people for crowd control. The patients we saw had names, ages, and medical histories. None of us knew where they came from, who they were outside the hospital, or how important they were. Public hospitals in India have always been congested and overloaded, but this time it seemed very different. Was it because it was so misty behind the face shield? Could it be because the workforce was full of fresh medical graduates, interns, alternate medicine practitioners, fresh nursing graduates, electricians and plumbers who were placed as nursing assistants, sanitation workers, and pharmacists who worked as patient attendants? It could be because patients were in a state of panic, scared to enter this massive tent with the feeling that they might not return, disinformed, misinformed, or underinformed. Some of them were even abandoned at the doorstep by their families. Was it because we in PPE look like Teletubbies? Could it be because nobody knew what was going on or what was going to happen? It was true existential dread that you could see in the eyes of the patients and the COVID workforce alike. So in between seeing patients, we as MSF started introducing small and incremental operational changes. We cleared up a corner and set up a pharmacy in cupboards. We also set up a crash cart. We started the practice of writing our names with permanent markers on the PPE to humanize the situation a little bit. We introduced proformas for history taking to save time and established a sort of proto triage. This made things a little more systematic, but the hospital was far from becoming a place where patients could feel comfortable. Bed occupancy went up to 110% in late September, early October. That is, we didn't have space, we didn't have beds for patients. They were waiting in between beds while we could clear up patients, while we could clear up space for these guys. And yeah, and we were there to witness it. And many things happened that could not be unseen. The first wave started to ebb in late October. By then, the best of us had burnt out and left. I saw an opportunity and took on a different role. As doctors, there's only so much you can do. It's a lesson we learned from calling codes. The team leader never touches the patient. The second you do that, you have to be completely focused on what you're doing, and you lose perspective and the ability to plan ahead. What we did was develop a strategy for technical and non-technical advocacy, and I took on the mantle of the implementer. Days, weeks were spent negotiating for innovations in patient care, regular trainings for doctors and nurses, bedside ultrasound for critical care, wellness initiatives, conflict mediation, strengthening the triage, patient advocacy, physiotherapy. Many were successfully implemented and some were not. A high dependency unit, a space where we put the sickest patients far away from the rest of the crowd and with good infection control. This was established for the sickest patients, and this was probably our most tangible success. This is what the space looked like when we were done with it. So along the way, there were some truly touching incidents that occurred. I'd like to speak about them because this seems like as good a time as any. And if I don't speak about it now, then they might go unheard. The first, not so much an incident as it became a phenomenon, was the total decimation of patient privacy. While in the observation, patients were hooked up to monitors and non-invasive ventilation machines like the HFNC, and they had nowhere to go. They were offered some privacy through screens, but it was barely enough to cover the foot of their bed. They would have to use bottles and bedpans to relieve themselves. I never imagined that I would have to literally stand by someone's bedside and have to direct the flow of their urine. But I had to do it, and I did. Next is the fact that I would have to drag myself to work every day. It reminds me of my childhood when my mother used to drag me to school, kicking and screaming. And I would stay on at the end of my shift to ensure a proper handover and then run to my room with a sense of relief that I really cannot describe, only to rinse and repeat. Every day in PPE during the first wave was like being under the influence of a hallucinogen. 1,000 racing thoughts through your head, 100 things to do, 50 people talking to you at the same time, talking at you, 10 things that need your immediate attention, but then only one goal: to get through your shift anyway, any which way you can, and hand over a stable ER for the next shift. Once one of our patients needed to be transferred to the ICU as soon as possible. She had developed pulmonary embolism and was intubated. So an ICU bed was ready, the ambulance was ready, we were ready to shift her. So we had wheeled her out to the gate and to the entrance where the ambulance was waiting, and we realized that the driver was missing. And we searched for him for about 5-10 minutes and we couldn't find the guy. And I had lost it. I had my head in my hands and I was literally almost in tears. And then one of my colleagues is like, to hell with this. He jumps into the driver's seat of the ambulance, starts the ambulance and drives off to the nearest tertiary center, which is 5 minutes away. Another time, we found a patient who was unresponsive on his bed. He had his bag and his belongings wrapped around him, and it looked like he was ready to go home. Indeed, he was discharged. We checked him. He didn't have a pulse. We started CPR, tubed him, and transferred him to the ICU. We didn't have any answer as to what happened to him. We weren't even asking a question. There were many memorable patients. One of them, still connected to his HFNC and monitors, picked a fight with another group of patients who were adding to the chaos, complaining about waiting times. He was yelling at the top of his voice, and his heart rate and his blood pressure were through the roof. He was yelling, "Can't you see how hard these guys are working?" So these are just a few stories I wanted to share. The biggest challenge we faced was to expect people to be stoic. We had a patient who was crashing and crashing fast. A young doctor who before COVID had pledged his life to rural primary health and strengthening the rural public health system. He wrote poetry and romance as a side gig. He stood agape, watching in shock. We had to grab him and say, "Come on, man, step up. We can talk about this later when you've seen this through to the end, but we need you right now." Another challenge was the inability to form bonds with our patients. You could have a great conversation with one of them, make them smile, and leave your shift feeling like you made someone else's day, only to come in for your next shift to find that they had deteriorated overnight and had to be tubed and shifted to the ICU. A huge personal challenge for me was keeping my close relationships outside of work. I would barely speak with my parents and my closest friends. Props to them for continually reaching out to me without the expectation of a reply or even acknowledgement. I miss them. Lessons and insights that I picked up through my work as a frontliner was that the HFNC model in low resource settings for moderate case management, it works. I cannot show you the numbers, but I can vouch for it from my experience. Next is to never underestimate the resilience of patients. The biggest example being how they managed to cope with their loss of privacy. I thought the situation was dehumanizing in every way, but they somehow managed to preserve their dignity with such grace. It's something I'm yet to make complete sense of. Another thing that I learned is that regular reflection is an absolute necessity, both technically and emotionally. It's one of the best adjusted mechanisms to cope and the best way to get better. I can now say that I am a part of a professional family. And at this point, we are a team of highly skilled and talented doctors and technicians ready to go anywhere and replicate this HFNC model in any setting, anywhere in the world. Next steps, Mumbai is now experiencing its second wave. Being the financial capital of the country, it would be disastrous to impose a complete lockdown, and I don't see it happening. Again, it's happened once and people suffered. People that I speak to are saying, "I don't care what happens to me now. I just can't sit at home anymore. It's not helping me. It's not helping my family." And if anybody has been to Mumbai, you will surely know how difficult it is to physically distance here. This is quite a recent picture. It is as beautiful as it is frustrating. All I can vouch for is that we are better prepared now. The authorities that we are in touch with are confident of achieving adequate vaccine coverage before the end of the year. That is about 60 to 75% of a city of 18 million people. Genotyping has just been operationalized in the city last week. So it remains to be seen how the balance of new strains, if it is new mutants, if it is the India variant, versus large-scale vaccination affect the shape of the pandemic. In conclusion, I've used the word I and we interchangeably. The truth is that it's hard for me to trace where ideas really came from, where support really came from, where thoughts really came from, where humor came from, where coping mechanisms came from. And I would like to believe that I'm here to represent a collective lived experience and not just my own. And I would also like to mention the impact that stress has on memory. And I may not have done justice to all the people who touched lives during the pandemic. This is a picture of our team, and everyone is equally important. Thank you. That's my time.
Thank you so much. It was really inspiring, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is very inspired by your talk and all the hard work that you mentioned by sharing your experience. I think it was especially inspiring to hear all the innovative ways that you and your team had to quickly reorganize the hospital, and I was really touched by how much you prioritize patient welfare and experience amidst all this chaos. So yeah, thank you. And I'm going to let Aisha introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, and thank you for your talk. So our next panelist is Dr. Hazar Kabir. She graduated from Harvard Medical School in 2017 and is currently completing her residency in emergency medicine. She's an upcoming fellow in health policy and health services research as part of the National Clinician Scholars Program at Yale. She also has a background in global health and has previously conducted operational work for MSF and has also published research on HIV prevention strategies for at-risk young women living in one of the highest HIV prevalence regions in South Africa. She will be speaking about these social disparities that have shaped every stage of this pandemic in the US. So I'll hand over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this awesome panel. I've learned so much so far and found Dr. Hergovin's talk really inspiring myself. So it's great to be able to hear everybody's perspectives from across the world. So as Aisha kindly introduced me, I'm Hazar Kabir. I'm one of the senior residents at the Harvard Affiliated Emergency Medicine Residency Program. We are a combined program. We're at both Mass General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm going to be providing some perspective regarding the United States experience with COVID-19. And the aim really is to exemplify how disparities are fundamentally relative and can occur dramatically even within the borders of a single nation. So despite the rhetoric that, that you might have heard across the pond prior to January 20th of this year, the United States has fared very poorly when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world and spending the highest per GDP on healthcare, our COVID cases are the highest in the world at over about 29 million cases total. The United States accounts for approximately 25% of the world's COVID-19 cases. And we are, truly number one, as former President Donald Trump would say, when it comes to COVID-19. I don't mean to make light of this. It's actually quite a tragedy that we've all experienced here, particularly the healthcare workers, including my colleagues in the front lines in the emergency department. And just to kind of illustrate how bad the pandemic has been in the United States, does anybody know the country with the second highest number of cases in the world? Not a trick question. I won't leave you guys hanging too much. It's actually Brazil. And just to kind of give you an understanding of how bad the pandemic has been in the United States, Brazil has had about 11 million cases. And so the United States has had double the number of cases as the second highest country. So with those numbers, while those numbers are absolutely staggering, we know, those of us who have practiced on the front lines and those of us who are engaged in health policy and health services research from an academic standpoint, we know that some have fared far better than others during this pandemic. And the burden of mortality has fallen largely on the shoulders of a few distinct populations, including indigent patient populations, historically marginalized patient populations, and elderly individuals who reside in congregate settings. And in highlighting the inequities in the COVID-19 outcomes in the US, I wanted to focus on two of those categories in particular. The top two categories in this cartoon here, Black and poor patient populations. These two demographic domains have a high rate of intersection. And there, as you'll kind of hear in this talk, there's a large historical precedent to some of the outcomes that we've witnessed over the past year in terms of the burden that these populations have borne during the pandemic. So no matter what the source is that you look at, the numbers show that racial and ethnic minorities have borne the greatest burdens in morbidity and mortality. The top table here is from a well-known US think tank called the Kaiser Foundation. It actually is a company that also is a integrated health system that has a lot of hospitals and healthcare clinics in California in particular. And they have data from the Epic Health Research Network, which is Epic, if you're not familiar, is actually an EMR, an electronic medical record system that tends to be pretty ubiquitous, at least at large academic hospitals around the country. And they looked at Epic data across the entire country and found that racial and ethnic minorities had the highest hospitalization and death rates per 100,000 people. And this was also seen in US Center for Disease Control, which is the federal agency here in the United States that's in charge of pandemic response, that also has provided data that demonstrates that inequities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality have fallen largely on the backs of historically marginalized racial and ethnic minorities, including Black, Hispanic, and Native American or American Indian populations. Overall, these data kind of are ubiquitous in showing that hospitalization mortality rates have been 2 to 3 times higher in these patient populations compared to Caucasian patient populations. And we know from data from the CDC, from the Centers for Disease Control, that majority Black counties have had 3 times the infection rate and nearly 6 times the mortality of majority white counties. And this is not because, Black people have failed to take the pandemic seriously in the United States. There have been multiple surveys that have shown that Black survey respondents are much more likely, about twice as likely as white respondents, to view COVID-19 as a major threat and are very concerned about the impact on their health and take very serious COVID precautions. So why is this happening? Why is there such a tremendous disparity, relative disparity within the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world? This, to provide an explanation for this requires a little bit of a history lesson in the United States, history of racism. When I used the term earlier, historically marginalized patient populations to describe the populations that we've seen kind of suffer the most during the COVID pandemic. What I mean specifically by that is populations that have experienced systematic disenfranchisement over hundreds of years while residing in the United States. And when I specify disenfranchisement, I want to be really clear kind of in the slide and don't want to kind of beat around the bush and calling out the system that has driven this disenfranchisement. And that system, quite frankly, is racism. In the United States, there's been an intimate relationship between race, medicine, and healthcare in Western American society. I particularly like this article here by Bird and Clayton that was published back in 2001 that does an extremely thorough job of outlining the historical evolution of the concept of race and the system of racism. They outline how some of the fathers of Western medicine and European medicine established the racial inferiority mythology and stereotypes. Such theories were routinely taught in US medical schools in the 18th, 19th, and the first half of the 20th centuries. And I have an illustration here of one of the physicians who, one of the early physicians who made myths of biological inferiority of Black races dogma in medicine. It's Robert Dunkelson. He's a British-born physician who has been deemed kind of the father of American physiology. And he published a textbook where he separated humans into 3 distinct racial types: the Caucasian, the Negroid, and the Mongolian. And at the bottom here, figure 1D is a pictorial representation of the stereotypical Negroid racial category. And this is the pictorial representation of the Mongolian racial category. And he was not subtle or shy in expressing in this textbook that he considered Negroes inferior, and alleged that they held a kind of middle place in between Caucasians and the orangutan. And so, so a lot of these health outcomes that we're seeing and experiencing right at this moment during the COVID pandemic have deep and distant historical roots. And it's not something that the United States healthcare system is not privy to. The cover here on the left is a report from what probably is the seminal paper on healthcare disparities in the United States called Unequal Treatment. It's a 700-page document that kind of outlines in great detail the evidence behind racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare within the United States. It's published by the Institute of Medicine back in 2003. And Institute of Medicine, for you guys, because I know you probably are not familiar with the US system, is an independent nonprofit organization that is essentially the authoritative figure in providing advice to decision makers on public health and healthcare delivery changes that need to be made in the United States. So, to kind of summarize the 700 pages of text that are outlined in Unequal Treatment, it comes down to these kind of main points. Across virtually every therapeutic intervention, ranging from high-tech procedures to the most elementary forms of diagnostic and treatment therapeutics and interventions, minorities receive fewer procedures and have poor access to medical care compared to whites. And these differences, it's important to note, persist even after differences in health insurance, socioeconomic status, and the severity of disease, their comorbidities, and the type of medical facility that they access are taken into account, even after accounting for these other factors that often are intersectional with race. We see these disparities persist. And just to kind of demonstrate how race in itself is a risk factor for poor health in the United States, even within nationally organized and the closest kind of form of universal health care that we have in the US through programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, the Veterans Affairs Health Service System here in the US, we still see differences in racial outcomes, even though there's universal access across races to these governmental healthcare delivery systems. So what is the pathophysiologic kind of basis for structural racism resulting in higher COVID-19 morbidity and mortality among these historically marginalized communities? I think that, this audience probably is really aware and has a good understanding of the importance and the significance of the social determinants of health. We know that the historical myths of disenfranchisement that we saw that I just outlined in terms of the history of racism in medicine translate directly to structural and social factors that result in poor health outcomes. So in the United States, non-white, non-English speaking, and lower socioeconomic populations are the most likely to have clinical comorbidities or chronic conditions that predispose them to acquiring COVID and to getting more sick from COVID, to having severe or critically ill kind of clinical pictures once they get COVID-19. And then we also know that in terms of kind of some of the public health initiatives and messaging that was disseminated throughout the COVID pandemic to try to help reduce individual risk for acquiring COVID-19, we know that these populations have limited ability to socially distance, to self-isolate, and that's because they oftentimes, these patient populations live in multi-generational homes. They have unstable housing, they have food insecurity, they have poor access to private transportation, and they have limited social networks. They also oftentimes are essential workers, and they rely on incomes from low income and low benefit jobs. And so, you know, I think a lot of us here were, or those of us who weren't directly involved in clinical care, had the privilege of being able to self-isolate and, you know, work from home, or, you know, go to school from home. And that's just not something that these historically marginalized patient populations have as an option. And being essential workers, you know, working as transit workers, working as environmental services employees in hospitals, they're required to come to work, and that fundamentally increases the risk of acquiring COVID-19. It also increases their risk of being exposed to COVID-19 because they're, by definition, working in essential jobs that mean that they are interfacing with many individuals in the community. So the figures that I put up earlier regarding the disparities in COVID health outcomes by race aren't just a shocking, you know, statistic that we can kind of look at and, you know, lament in retrospect. You know, those of us who worked in the emergency department and in the ICUs felt those numbers every day that we showed up to a shift. The photograph that I have displayed here is right outside the Mass General Emergency Department. So that's one of the hospitals where I work. And you can see that there are loads of ambulances lined up to drop off patients in the ED. And our hospital, you know, saw tremendous increases in the disproportionate representation of racial minorities in COVID cases. So there was a 400% increase in Black and Latinx patients coming to the emergency department because they bore the brunt of the burden of the incidence of COVID in our communities. About 35 to 40% of patients at Mass General were admitted to the hospital with COVID-19 were Latinx. And I just kind of wanted to kind of paint a picture of kind of what it was like working in the emergency department in the ICU. This is a quote from one of my colleagues who's Puerto Rican actually, and her experience working in the ED and serving as a translator and seeing her colleagues kind of work in the ED and trying to care for these Latinx patient populations that were severely burdened by COVID. She says, in the emergency room, conversations about a patient's end-of-life wishes are taking place in broken Spanish seconds before they get intubated. In the intensive care unit, doctors barely have time to update family members because they're too bogged down by patient care tasks to call an interpreter. For patients healthy enough to go home, our usual script around social distancing falls short, as many of our Black and Latino patients are unable to self-isolate within large multi-generational homes. In addition, many of these patients either are essential workers or live with one. They cannot simply stay home. So I lay out the context of the US epidemiologic experience with COVID, you know, the fact that we're #1 in terms of overall cases and mortality, in addition to the historical foundation of the inequities that preceded the pandemic, to illustrate the significance of decision-making that occurred around two key issues and the lessons that these two decisions can teach us. And these decisions were around, one, who gets critical care resources. So decision-making around the distribution of critical care resources was institutionalized, as I'll explain, through policies called crisis standards of care. The second decision that I'll discuss today is around who is prioritized for vaccine allocation. We're seeing the dysfunction and abuse of these systems of vaccine allocation currently, and we're seeing that there are populations that are being left behind this very second. So why do I chose on these two issues, these two topics about, you know, scarce resource allocation to kind of illustrate the point and theme of the US being kind of the champion of COVID disparities domestically? It's because, you know, as I like to say, resources are the currency of equity, whether it be globally or locally. There's a brilliant professor here at Harvard. He's professor of public health named Dr. David Williams, who has a quote about the social determinants of health that says, the socioeconomic status is a central determinant of the distribution of valuable resources in society. And I think it's, you know, in seeing how these resources are allocated, we can really kind of see lessons in how systems can perpetuate social disparities and social inequities and can leave patient populations behind. So, as was the case in the United Kingdom, there was legitimate concern during both the initial and second surge of COVID within the US that hospitals would not have the capacity to meet the demands of high patient volumes. This figure here is from the University of Minnesota and NPR, and it demonstrates that there were periods when hospitals experienced significant resource constraints due to the need to take care of a large number of COVID-19 patients. And so there was really a legitimate concern that we were not going to have enough ventilators, we were not going to have enough ICU beds to meet the demand and to take care of all the patients who came through our hospital doors. And so this really led hospital leaders and state policy makers to kind of feel that they had a duty to plan specifically around how critical care resource would be allocated. And they created this system of these guidelines called crisis standards of care. And this system was going to be in lieu of a first come, first serve system, which many arguments are made from a bioethical standpoint of that being fundamentally unfair, because those who are able to come to the hospital first are privileged in that they have access to transportation, or they are physically located closer to the areas of healthcare delivery. And so they wanted to come up with a kind of fairer, more deliberate system for deciding who gets a ventilator, who gets an ICU bed, should there be a situation where there were not enough resources to go around. And so the crisis standards of care guidelines that were created were basically a framework for coming up with specific criterion that would be used to either prioritize or deprioritize a patient for a critical resource like a ventilator or an ICU bed. And in my state, Massachusetts, my state was one of the first states to publish such guidelines. And the framework that was used initially, that was published early in April, I think it was first week of April, when there was first surge that New York and that we experienced in Boston. The first criteria that were used were some objective criteria. So one of the the fundamental criteria that's pretty ubiquitous across crisis standards of care, depending on, across all the states that release the guidelines, are something called the SOFA score, or the sequential organ failure assessment score. And so that used objective measures like Glasgow coma score, GCS, arterial oxygen levels, FiO2, platelet counts, bilirubin, mean arterial pressure, or if the patient was on pressors, that would give them a point in terms of deprioritizing them for a ventilator or for critical care resources. And then it would also kind of use other lab values to kind of determine the kind of concept behind it was to try to determine who would benefit the most from these resources, who was going to be the most likely to survive should they have the option to go on a ventilator or to have an ICU bed. And so the higher the SOFA score, the higher the level of acute, the more sick the patient was acutely. And so that would essentially dock the patient points in terms of prioritization, because the likelihood of them surviving based on being so severely sick up front would lower their probability of survival. That was the thought process. The other criteria that were used were patient chronic comorbidities. And these comorbidities were surprisingly really broad initially. Massachusetts initially specified hypertension, CKD or chronic kidney disease, diabetes, heart failure, HIV, even HIV, as a chronic condition that would lower their risk of long-term survival. And so that patients who had those chronic conditions would be deprioritized for an ICU bed or a ventilator. And it was interesting to kind of to note initially, what conditions were put on the list of comorbidities that would reduce the probability of 1 year and 5 year survival, and which conditions were omitted. Mass General sees a lot. It's a tertiary care facility, so we see a lot of highly specialized or highly complex medical conditions. We have a lot of patients who have cystic fibrosis, and a lot of the kind of health advocates in my community really noted that that there was an absence of mention of cystic fibrosis as as one of the clinical conditions that would deem a patient to be less likely to survive, even though we know through our experience that the life expectancy of those who have cystic fibrosis is low, and let alone if they have an acute illness like COVID-19, could be projected to be lower than even 1 year potentially. And so as frontline physicians in the Boston area, my coworkers and I kind of saw firsthand, and we had that experience of kind of living the numbers of the disparities and seeing African American and Latinx patients bearing the brunt of morbidity and mortality. And in seeing the crisis standards of care guidelines, we were able to immediately recognize that these guidelines would essentially deprioritize the historically marginalized patient populations that were already bearing the brunt of the pandemic. And it was immediately after these guidelines were released to the public and were presented at our hospital system, we really quickly kind of built a coalition around demonstrating to healthcare administrators, both within our hospital systems, within Mass General and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and at the state level, that these guidelines would almost certainly perpetuate some of the inequities that were already existing in the pandemic. And so we took and the way that we kind of explained it is that this is some of the text that I have from an earlier slide that shows that the reason why these historically marginalized patient populations were seeing higher rates of COVID infection and had higher morbidity and mortality was because they had chronic conditions due to social and structural factors that they experience in their everyday life, due to the fact that some of those same factors increase their risk of acquiring COVID and giving it to their family members. And so to then kind of make some of these social and structural factors and these chronic conditions a part of the schemes to limit their access to the critical care resources that they needed more than other patient populations was essentially another nail in the coffin that would mean that our overall health outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities would be worse than they were already projected to be. And so, we weren't going to kind of stand still and by the wayside and let these guidelines kind of manifest and turn into dogma and in our healthcare system. And so we were able to form a coalition with other physicians in our community and in the Boston area. We formed partnerships with Boston Medical Center, which is another large hospital system in Boston. And then we also kind of formed community engagement partnerships with ethicists, with disability and health advocates, with hospital administrators to raise awareness about the potential for these guidelines to perpetuate and worsen inequities. So that was one kind of arm of our efforts, was the community engagement piece. The second arm was legislative coalition building. And so we went to the Boston City Council on the city level and presented these guidelines and their implications to our council members within the city to educate them on the deleterious effects that they could have. And then we also went to the Black and Latino caucus on the state level, Massachusetts level, to also advocate for these guidelines to change. And in addition to the legislative coalition building, we went to the media and educated the media and translating some of these guidelines, because you can imagine, SOFA score, chronic health conditions. A lot of this requires a great degree of savvy and literacy, medical literacy, to be able to understand. And so it was very easy for policymakers to produce these and publish these guidelines, and for everyday kind of community folks to not recognize their implications and their significance. And so engaging in with the media, with NPR, with other media outlets was really critical to kind of light the fire under the policymakers to try to inspire them to advocate for changing the guidelines. And ultimately we were successful. So Massachusetts removed consideration of chronic health conditions from crisis standards of care due to the advocacy efforts on our city and state level. We due to the kind of the nature of being clinicians with vast kind of academic networks across the country, we're able to inspire similar our coworkers and our colleagues in other states to take on similar advocacy efforts in their state to try to get crisis standards of care in their state to make sure that they're not perpetuating health inequities, and they're not disenfranchising historically marginalized patient populations. So that's kind of the first lesson in how policy making and decision making can really do harm during a public health emergency and during a pandemic. The second lesson I want to discuss is one that we're all living through at the moment, and one that one of the co-panelists, Roz, outlined really beautifully on international level, and that's that of vaccine allocation. So vaccine allocation, has been tremendously unequal and concerning on an international scale. And another lesson of how health disparities are, relative. Within the United States, one of the countries that has managed to secure massive access to available supply of vaccines, there have been clear disparities in vaccine distribution that are emerging. This was really clear from the outset in the very first days of vaccine distribution in the United States. Back in December is when we kind of got word at Mass General that we would receive access to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines here, and that distribution would commence at the end of the month. And it was in reading kind of and anticipating kind of the way that public health emergencies manifest and who kind of ultimately gets left behind. I think it was very clear to me from that stage that that there was going to be a potential for further widening of healthcare inequities, and for the historically marginalized patient populations that we were taking care of and seeing in the emergency department in the hospital, to have limited access to this other scarce or critical resource, which is the vaccine. And it's interesting because societal consensus and intention around vaccine allocation before the vaccines were available, back when they were still being developed, seemed to be unified in the United States. So the U.S. and CDC and other kind of governing bodies made it clear that that there would be kind of a tiered approach to vaccine allocation, and that frontline healthcare workers and vulnerable patient populations would be given priority for the first shots. This was actually, something that was direct, policy was published on the CDC website, and that there were recommendations made that high-risk healthcare workers, first responders, people with 2 or more underlying conditions, older adults, and those who lived in, overcrowded settings, and those communities that were the highest burden of incidence or mortality from COVID-19 would be prioritized. However, the reality of vaccine distribution thus far has been marred by exploitation of longstanding socioeconomic power structures, and there are signs that that the privileged and wealthy have been really eager to access vaccines before others. This is not a new lesson. In the decades before the polio vaccine, the treatment of polio in the United States was shamefully segregated. Some medical experts even falsely and outrageously asserted that African Americans were simply not as susceptible to polio as white patients. And some polio treatment centers actually did not accept Black patients initially. And so we can see that some of the rhetoric around access is how these disparities in critical resource allocation is perpetuated and is justified. And I have another great example of that coming up shortly in another slide. And so, what we've seen so far, what we're living through currently is the fact that U.S. vaccine distribution thus far has been fundamentally unfair, and that the same populations that have borne the greatest burdens with regard to morbidity and mortality have been vaccinated at the lowest rates. You can see from figures here from the Centers for Disease Control that white people have had vaccination rates that have been twice as high as those of Hispanic and Black patient populations. And one thing I want to note that we have an asterisk here to remind myself to mention another kind of concerning limitation of some of these CDC reports is the fact that there's no federal requirement across the United States for states to provide data on critical resource allocation, whether it be ventilators or ICU beds or hospitalization rates, and more recently vaccine access data in terms of demographic categories. And so there's a very high possibility, and it's really likely that we're underestimating these disparities just simply because states are choosing not to keep track of how these resources are allocated. And I think that's a really dangerous way or system for some of these inequities to be perpetuated. So I mentioned the rhetoric around ways to kind of perpetuate inequities, and I included the slide because it's really important to note, to observe this rhetoric around emerging inequities in vaccine access. And you'll hear, or you might hear in the news, the excuse or the explanation that that Black patients and minorities are not being vaccinated at the same rates as white patients because they are reluctant to do so, because they're vaccine hesitant. And this is an article that was published in the New York Times by a physician activist, Dr. Rhea Boyd. She's a pediatrician. She does a lot of work on calling out racial disparities and publishes both academically and for lay press on the issue. And she really refutes this excuse and argues that it's actually an issue of access, and that historically marginalized populations have less access to vaccines. They don't have the option to be reluctant or decline a vaccine because they don't have access to these vaccines to begin with. And this can be seen here in data from Washington, D.C., where you can see that, that the wards or neighborhoods that had the most lives lost, and these are largely Black neighborhoods, have the lowest vaccination rates. This is data that's concurrent as of yesterday. And this is despite actually DC, there's survey data that exists from DC that shows that Black citizens in DC are willing and eager to get vaccinated. And so this excuse of vaccine hesitancy or reluctance is really not applicable in this community, in this patient population. And we can see that it's fundamentally an issue of access. And I think this is also kind of demonstrated by some of the counter initiatives that have tried to impact some of these inequities that we're seeing in vaccine distribution. There are groups of minority physicians in different states around the country that have used community organizing to take the issue of access into their own hands. This picture here is from an article from Philadelphia that where there's a coalition of Black physicians that set up a COVID vaccine campaign in Black community centers, and they were actually able to outpace the entire state of Pennsylvania in terms of daily vaccination rates. And they obviously had the majority of the patients that they were vaccinating were historically marginalized racial and ethnic minorities in poor neighborhoods. And we see here another kind of example from North Carolina where Black health professionals are kind of taking this into their own hands and going to these communities and trying to improve access, and they're making gains in terms of reducing some of the gaps in vaccine allocation for these historically marginalized patient populations. So overall, what we've learned from the US lesson in COVID-19 disparities is that there is a duty to plan around historically marginalized patient populations to prevent policy decisions, these two policy decisions that I've outlined as examples, from doing harm. We know that racial and socioeconomic disparities have manifested at every stage of this pandemic. And it should not be a surprise to policymakers and healthcare administrators, based on the knowledge that we have that racial minorities and poor patient populations have experienced systematic disenfranchisement over hundreds of years, as I've outlined in my earlier slides. And so, we also know that, so there's really no excuse to, to retrospectively review some of the data and outcomes that we're seeing, and how much greater of a burden these patient populations have borne through this pandemic, knowing that this is just history essentially repeating itself. It's the duty to plan or duty to prepare that was evoked in producing crisis standards of care guidelines should be similarly provoked in trying to reduce the burden of morbidity and mortality in these patient populations. Something that I kind of argue in one of the articles that we published in NPR is that it makes sense to prioritize historically marginalized patient populations. If you look at a lot of the ethical principles and frameworks that are used to justify creating, vaccine allocation strategies that target specific patient populations, or crisis standards of care that determine critical resource allocation, a lot of these guidelines and these plans and these strategies use justification of ethical principles to bolster their rationales for coming up with these schemas. And I would argue that utilitarianism, which is one of the fundamental principles that are evoked in producing these plans for scarce resource allocation, is in line with prioritizing and making sure that you don't leave historically marginalized patient populations behind. Utilitarianism, for those who are not familiar, is the concept of doing that which maximizes the good for the greatest number of people. So we know that morbidity and mortality has been highest for these patient populations. And so if we want to reduce overall COVID-19 deaths, why would you not prioritize these patient populations that are bearing the brunt of the burden in providing them access to treatment and to prevention through critical resource allocation, through the crisis standards of care, or through vaccine allocation strategies that specifically think of and plan around these patient populations. The other kind of principle that is evoked quite commonly in schemas for scarce resource allocation is that of distributive justice. And that's the distribution of benefits to individuals should be proportional to the burdens that they bear. So this concept of distributive justice, we very comfortably applied to other aspects of medical care, whether it be triaging patients in the emergency department. I see patients who are the sickest first, right? Because they need my resources the most. We also apply this in disaster response, in that, there's a very specific criteria for which patients get priority when there's limited human resources and ability to help. And then lastly, we use it for determining which patients are put at the top of the list for organ donation. And so these aren't really new principles, and there's no excuse for not applying them in a pandemic setting, when we know that every public health emergency that the United States has experienced, these patient populations have been left behind. So kind of looking to the future, something that I'm thinking about now that we're at the stage of, the United States, I think the figures that 20% of our demographic population has been vaccinated. So there's this concept, or there's this consensus that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that we're reaching the end of the pandemic. Hopefully that's not, we're not jinxing ourselves and not kind of instigating another surge. But something to think about when we do finally reach the end of this pandemic is making sure to monitor post-pandemic healthcare services access and utilization. I think there's been a lot of focus on, rightfully so, because COVID is essentially what we were dealing with the most during the past year. There's a lot of focus on COVID health disparities, but there's evidence that is emerging, and this is actually a research interest of mine that I'm working on with some of our healthcare policy professors here at Harvard. There's kind of emerging evidence that's showing that there are non-COVID-19 related disparities that have been widened in the setting of the pandemic. And so, there's evidence that there are folks who normally would have presented to the emergency department for stroke-like symptoms who have avoided it because of fear around acquiring COVID. And that, not surprisingly, based on the historical context, that Black and Latinx patients have been more reluctant than other patient populations to seek care, and there's a widening of these chronic disparities that already existed before the pandemic. And so we really need to kind of start to shift our gaze away from just COVID disparities and to some of the other chronic health disparities that have really worsened in the pandemic setting. And then there's another kind of post-pandemic kind of planning focus that I am advocating in our hospital systems that we address transparently. And that's, during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of surgical care that was put on hold, particularly elective care. And some of that has begun to ramp back up. And so we want to make sure that that there's equal distribution of some of these surgical procedures that were delayed during the pandemic, and that there's not disparities in patient access to surgical oncology treatment interventions or to elective orthopedic procedures, and that there's these historically marginalized patient populations aren't left behind from that standpoint as well. And then lastly, I have emphasized quite a bit, I think, that that everything from history to our current experience with COVID-19 demonstrates that these patient populations are left behind. Historically marginalized racial and ethnic minorities, poor patients are left behind. And so I think that requires while this experience is fresh, that requires us to change the very framework that we use for disaster response and for preparing for public health emergencies. There's in emergency medicine, there's very specific kind of literature, and there's very specific organizations that focus on coming up with hospital incident command structures. And none of those structures include any arm or body or resources that are devoted to measuring and addressing inequities. And I think that's, based on what we've learned so far and based on what we know from prior public health emergencies, that needs to change. And so that's kind of something that we're working on in the future, is to try to kind of address that from a system standpoint in our disaster response schemas.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, this is just a reminder that we're a bit overrunning in terms of time. So if...
Oh, that's it, actually, I'm done.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So
of course.
I'll let Aisha take over from now.
Thank you so much. We've learned a lot from your talk, and it was really nice to hear about success as well that you spoke about from when you campaigned against some inequalities that had essentially just become embedded within the framework, within the guidelines. And thank you also for your short insight into your experience as a doctor and sharing your colleague's quote. I think it was really powerful. It captured a lot within a few words. I think, Murray, if you could introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you again for your talk. So moving on to our next speaker, we're very lucky to be joined by Sir Michael Marmot, who has been a professor of epidemiology at UCL since 1985 and has authored many publications on the social determinants of health, including the influential Per Society Healthy Lives, the Marmot Review, and the book The Health Gap. So as an advisor to the WHO Director General, he is very renowned in his field and has extensive experience in advocating for health equality. We're very grateful for you taking the time to join us. And yeah, we look forward to hearing about your insights. So I'll let you take over.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to join you. I've called this Build Back Fairer because it's the title I gave to the report that I published in December 2020. As we emerge from the pandemic, we want to build back fairer. Just to put it in a global perspective, before the pandemic struck, I had chaired the Commission of the Pan American Health Organization on Equity and Health Inequalities in the Americas, and we published our report in 2019. Health Equity and Dignified Lives, we called it, Just Societies. And we began with the quote from Nelson Mandela: "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. It's the protection of fundamental human rights, the right to dignity and a decent life." And our conceptual framework was looking at structural drivers, political, social, cultural, and economic structures, the natural environment, land and climate change, ongoing colonialism and structural racism, the conditions of daily life, and then two related to recommendations, governance and human rights. And the outcome is health equity and dignified lives. And we took an approach of intersectionality, looking at social and economic inequities, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and migration. And I can't resist showing you this because I just saw it, the photo. On the 31st of March, we will publish Build Back Fairer, Achieving Health Equity in the Eastern Mediterranean region. So the WHO Eastern Mediterranean region invited me to chair a commission on social determinants of health, and we will publish our report on the 31st of March. So do look out for it. I heard the talk that's just finished, very much about inequities in the healthcare system, vitally important. But my perspective, the opening line of my book, The Health Gap, was why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick. So my perspective is the conditions that make people sick. The Human Development Report, published by the UNDP, produced a special report last year looking at the impact of COVID-19. So stylized, here's the global burden of mortality from transport injuries, HIV/AIDS, self-harm, malaria, and here's the actual deaths of COVID-19 globally during the first wave. The UNDP publishes a Human Development Index, which has three components: life expectancy, education, and gross national income per person, adjusting for purchasing power. And going back to 1990, this is the improvement globally of the Human Development Index. And you can see some years it improved a bit more rapidly, some years a bit more slowly. Here's the global financial crisis, a bit slower improvement. And here is the predicted effect in 2020 of COVID-19. Absolutely dramatic impact globally. And then the UNDP gives the example of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, looking at deaths 2 months after the hurricane and the rise in mortality, particularly in the lowest socioeconomic group, the medium socioeconomic group, and the highest. Any major external shock, in general, exposes the underlying inequalities in society and exaggerates them. And that is what we could predict that the pandemic would do: expose the underlying inequalities in society and exaggerate them. Now, I want to talk about England for a bit. Just before the pandemic crashed upon us, I had published in February 2020, Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on. So to go back, I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. We published our report in 2008. And following that, the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, Gordon Brown, invited me to conduct a review of health inequalities in England. His question was, how could we apply the findings and recommendations of your global committee to one country, England? And we published the Marmot Review as Fair Society, Healthy Lives. So one decade later, 10 years later, we published this, looking back, what had happened in the previous 10 years. And the simple summary is, we've lost a decade and it shows. Life expectancy was improving for women and for men by about 1 year every 4 years. I've taken this back to 1980. I could go back for 100 years, and life expectancy was improving about 1 year every 4 years. In 2010-11, that improvement slowed dramatically and just about ground to a halt. What happened in 2010-11? Well, we had a new government, a Conservative-led coalition government. They were a bit sensitive. You can't surely be saying it was anything we did that led to this slowdown. It has to be looked at. One question that was raised, well, maybe we've just reached peak life expectancy. It's got to stop improving sometime. So we looked at what had happened in other countries. This is annual life expectancy improvement in weeks, 2011 to 2017. Estonia, Norway, Slovakia, Hungary, Denmark, Belgium, Austria, Japan. There's the UK. The slowest improvement of life expectancy of any of these rich countries except Iceland and the United States. So no, we had not reached peak life expectancy. What was going on in the UK was more marked than was going on in any of these other rich countries. And we have the issue of inequalities. Classify people by where they live and classify where they live by the level of deprivation. The most deprived, 10%, have shorter life expectancy than everybody else. But that's not the extent of inequalities. It's a social gradient. The less the deprivation, the longer the life expectancy. The gap between the least deprived 10% and the most deprived was 9.5 years for men, 7.7 years for women. And that gap was increasing. The gradient was getting steeper. The inequalities were getting bigger over the decade from 2010. And if we look by region, this is women, 2010-12, 2016-18. For the women living in the least deprived 10%, it didn't matter much where they lived. The regional differences were quite small, and life expectancy was improving for every region, albeit slowly. For the most deprived, the regional differences were much bigger. Life expectancy was improving in London for the most deprived, but going down pretty well everywhere else. So pre-pandemic, three things going on: slowdown and improvement in life expectancy, increased inequalities, and health for the poorest people getting worse. Not a good situation. In my 2010 review, we had 6 domains of recommendations of what to do about health inequalities: give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, fair employment and good work for all. Everybody in a rich country should have at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. Healthy and sustainable places and communities, and taking a social determinants approach to prevention. So this was from my 2010 Marmot Review, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. And just to summarize, most of these got worse over the decade. I waited 10 years to publish the 10-year-on review, but then the pandemic happened. So I only waited 10 months to publish the next one. And we called it Build Back Fairer, the COVID-19 Marmot Review. A conscious echo of the Build Back Better. We want to build back fairer. We want to use what had happened with the pandemic to say, we do not want to go back to the status quo before the pandemic hit us. That was far from desirable. We want to do something better and fairer. So if we look at inequalities, here's inequalities. This is men, but it's a similar picture for women. Mortality, all-cause mortality by level of deprivation. I showed you life expectancy before. This is just turning it upside down. You see the social gradient. And the pale green is COVID-19 mortality. It's almost exactly parallel to the social gradient in all causes. In other words, the causes of inequalities in COVID-19 mortality are very similar to the causes of inequalities in health more generally. That's really interesting. COVID-19 is caused by a virus. Diabetes isn't caused by a virus. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, ischemic heart disease, lung cancer, the big causes that go up into this social gradient in all cause mortality. The underlying social and economic inequalities are driving this. Now, at the bottom here, exposure in frontline occupations, living in overcrowded, possibly multi-generational households, will increase exposure. And then, of course, we have the ethnic differences. If we look at Black African women and men, high mortality from COVID-19. Much of that can be attributed to where people live, geography, which in turn is linked to deprivation, and other socioeconomic characteristics. Interestingly, prior ill health doesn't seem to be playing much of a role in the excess in Black African, this is in Britain, or in Black Caribbean. For Bangladeshi, again, we see the big increase, but their prior health conditions do seem to be playing some role, as they do in Pakistani. So for Black African, Black Caribbean, Bangladeshi, Pakistani people living in Britain, huge excess from COVID-19, much of it attributable to where people live, deprivation, other socioeconomic characteristics, and for Bangladeshi and Pakistani prior ill health. For Indians, there is an excess, although not as big as for these other groups. When you look at excess mortality in the first half of last year, in other words, how many deaths would have been predicted to occur based on the previous 5 years, not just COVID, all causes. It's a way of comparing what happened in Britain with other countries. The excess mortality was higher in England than in Scotland, higher than in Wales, higher than in Northern Ireland, and the excess mortality in the UK was higher than in any other rich country. Most of us looking at the US would say they had a disastrous handling of the pandemic. It was worse in the UK. The excess mortality was higher. Now that's really interesting. I think of health as a measure of societal success. Pre-pandemic, life expectancy was stalling, inequalities were increasing, and life expectancy for poorest people was falling. The slowdown in life expectancy was nearly the slowest of rich countries, except for Iceland and the United States. So if health is a measure of societal success, society wasn't doing very well, and inequalities in society were increasing over the decade from 2010. And then with the pandemic, we had the highest excess mortality. What's the link between these two? And I suggest poor governance and political culture, increasing social and economic inequalities, reduction in spending on public services. We were ill prepared coming into the pandemic, and we weren't very healthy, which wouldn't be good. Going back to the global picture, the pandemic is likely to exaggerate inequalities. This is short-term effective out-of-school rate for primary education. So pre-pandemic, in countries at a low level of human development, just under 27% of primary school-age children were effectively out of school. That went up to 86% during the pandemic. For countries at medium level of human development, 7% to 74%, 6% to 47%, and for very high human development countries, 1.4% up to 20%. And this is really interesting. Look at the effective out-of-school rate for primary education, school-age children. In 1970, it was about 28% of primary school-age children were effectively out of school. And it was coming down in a very pleasing way. So by 2019, it was less than 10%. And the blue here is what happened during the pandemic. But then they modeled what would have happened had there been no internet access. And in fact, if there'd been no internet access, the pandemic would have taken us back to 1970, taken us back 50 years to the out-of-school rate for primary school-age children. But modeling, if you could close the internet gap within a human development group, in other words, it's not saying that internet access in Somalia should be the same as Finland, but it should be as good as the best within that very low human development group. And that could nearly reverse the effect of the pandemic on the effective out-of-school rate. So it's an easily soluble problem. We just didn't bother solving it. Lord Peter Hennessy, a historian, contacted me over the Christmas New Year period, and he said, your Build Back Fairer report is a beverage for our time. Now, for those of you who don't know about Beveridge, during the Second World War, Beveridge published his report, and he said want is one only of 5 giants on the road of reconstruction, and in some way the easiest to attack. The others are disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And in fact, the Beveridge report laid the basis for the development of the welfare state in Britain and the National Health Service. We needed to attack, said Beveridge, these 5 giants. And I think of Beveridge as still relevant. I think as the 5th giant, disease, as being the outcome of the other 4. So want is relative poverty. We measure child poverty, for example, as less than 60% median income. It's a relative measure. Squalor is absolute deprivation. Homelessness, sleeping rough, inadequate housing, lack of food. Ignorance, education is of vital importance, and idleness, employment, and good working conditions. We need to build back fairer, a beverage for our time, to address these giants on the road to building a fairer society. I said that health is a measure of societal success. In my Build Back Fair report, I gave specific recommendations that relate to those I had in 2010. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, fair employment and good work for all, healthy standard of living for all, healthy and sustainable places and communities, including housing, as I mentioned with Beveridge, and strengthen the role and impact of ill health prevention. What we have to do is address these fundamental problems of poor governance and political culture, the increasing social and economic inequalities, the reduction in spending on public services that was done in a most regressive way, and the fact that we weren't very healthy. My recommendation to build back fairer is to put a fair distribution of health and well-being at the heart of all government policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and sharing your insights into the social determinants of health. Personally, I especially liked how you demonstrated how external shocks, such as a pandemic, will really expose and exacerbate existing inequalities. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. And now, because of time constraints, we will unfortunately have to skip the general panel questions, but I'll let Ayesha take over to ask one question per speaker from the audience.
Thank you. And I realize we are overrunning, so if any of the speakers do need to leave, that's all right. Thank you for joining, and thank you for all your amazing talks. So one of the most upvoted questions from the Slido is for Benny, and it's, is the immune system involved in long COVID?
In some ways, definitely. I mean, in the sense that aspects of inflammation, which is basically the immune system misfunctioning, are involved. But I think long COVID is probably a very heterogeneous group of diseases, and we don't fully understand what really drives it and how those different, it has very different manifestations in different people. So we don't fully understand how that works. But I'd be very surprised if there wasn't a fundamental immunological involvement in long COVID.
Thank you for that. For Dr. Gautam, so one of the questions is, what kept you going and gave you the resilience to continue working in such a difficult condition?
Thank you for the question. What happened was I made a choice to go work in such a situation. Then through the situation, I was constantly questioning my choices. And then you see the change that you're making, and that drives you to work harder. I suppose that's what kept me going.
Thank you. That was a really nice answer. For the other speakers, if anybody has any questions, I realize you probably haven't had as much time to enter anything using the Slido. So please do feel free to enter anything into the chat or just unmute and speak. But in the meantime, Dr. Hazar, is there any thing that you think that we as the audience should be doing anything within the next few years or even now to kind of campaign for health inequality related issues?
Yeah, I think that's something that I've come to realize throughout this pandemic, and a lot of the issues around equity that have come up is the demonstration that you really do have a lot of agency, particularly if you partner with others and you exercise community organizing skills and coalition building to impact policy decisions that could have negative effects on patient populations that are most vulnerable. I was very surprised to have that personal experience with the crisis centers of care. And I think the pandemic setting is one where you have to act fast and you have to organize very quickly. But that experience has really shown that, if you see a policy that's not correct, or that is aberrant, or that needs to be modified, joining together with a group of others and trying to kind of address the problem from a multi-pronged approach, community engagement, legislative action, and media engagement is really kind of the kind of recipe for having an effect and exercising your individual agency and pooling your agency as individuals to make an impact. And so I really encourage you guys, if you see a problem, in your community or in your healthcare system or on the government level, and if you recognize that is something that's shared across with others across your community, to join together and come up with a strategy for making an impact, because it is possible to make a change.
Thank you. I was wondering if Professor Marmot, you would also want to kind of add to that. It would be interesting to see both of your perspectives on the matter.
Very much so. I would endorse that. My view is there's a real appetite for change. Look what happened just now in the United States. President Biden, who was thought of as being somebody who was very middle of the road, people on the left were highly critical of him. They said it was just going to be business as usual. As a result of his policies, child poverty will be halved. Just like that. A middle of the road conservative former senator introduced new government policies that will halve child poverty overnight. We could do that here. There's got to be advocacy for it. So the fact that child poverty went up over the previous decade, I didn't show you all the data, but we documented that could be halved overnight. But we've got to stand up and say that's what we want to happen because it's possible to do it. So action's got to be at the community level. It's got to be from local government, from the voluntary and community sector, from healthcare, and at the national level. But it won't happen at the national level unless we demand it, campaign for it. So there's a great deal that we can all do.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the other speakers also would like to add to it. Maybe Professor Benny, would you like to add to it as well?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that I can add much to what was said. I mean, action. Of course, we can do things if we're absolutely determined. I completely agree with Professor Marmot, and it's just up to us to decide on the priorities. I'd say from the academic perspective of an academic, the thing that I feel that I can most contribute is a question of from the perspective of education. So we heard, I think, from one of the previous speakers that the lack of vaccine take-up was not a major reason why, for example, the Black Hispanic community in America were not being vaccinated, but rather a question of access. But I think there's very little doubt that there are massive inequalities in education across the world and in the UK and the US, everywhere, and they contribute to ill health of all sorts. So I think from our point of view, the most we can do, the best thing we can do is to continue to push for further education at all levels, from children upwards, because that's going to be a key plank in improving health. That's my feeling.
Thank you. If Dr. Gotham, you would like to add to that as well, in terms of what we can do to kind of impact any health inequalities?
I really don't have much to add in terms of how and what we can do as individuals. what health systems can do is to acknowledge and make things available, ensure everybody knows. From the Indian perspective, all of vaccine advertising is towards saying the vaccine is safe, and it ends there. It's the vaccine is safe, please take the vaccine. That's it, it ends there. I think we need to take more steps as civil society. We can step further, go in there and tell people why in a language that they do understand, and then help them come out and take the vaccines. It's not like it's inaccessible to them. They can come forward. There are proper mechanisms. It's quite simple. It's not difficult. There's no obfuscation there. You can just go to the place, get yourself vaccinated, and come back. So I think there's a huge, again, going back to the whole structural aspect of it, the disparities already exist. What we need to do is to try and close the gap for now, and then go back and try to address the problems, the first original problems.
Thank you. And we've had a question for Dr. Hazara within the chat. Why is there such a disparity in vaccine access despite the policy that ensures priority access to healthcare workers, comorbidities, and those who are elderly?
Thank you. Actually, I was just penning a long response to that in the chat, but it might be easier to just say it here. So yes, the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services here in the US, before the vaccines were even available, created not guidelines per se, because there was nothing enforceable about them. They were more like recommendations for prioritization schemas, where they said essential workers should be first, elderly patient population should be first, and communities that have been hardest hit should be prioritized. So the problem is that there was a promise early on in the first month of vaccine distribution that there would be 20 million people vaccinated, and the US by the end of the first month fell far short of that goal. And so there was a lot of pressure to try to get shots into arms as quickly as possible. And there was a lot of public outrage at the delays in vaccination. And one of the things that folks were blaming were these prioritization schemes, because they thought they were too complex. So that's one reason why they've kind of fallen by the wayside. The second reason is very intimately related to the culture of states' rights in the United States, and that the federal government has demonstrated, even, mainly with the Trump presidency, that there is a tremendous reluctance to institute any sort of national guidance or protocol or policy with regard to the pandemic. And so the CDC and HHS often produces these documents and these recommendations that they make public, but then it's up to states to ultimately come up with their allocation schemes. And so that's resulted in a patchwork of prioritization schemes across the country. States like Florida actually skipped over essential workers altogether and went straight to vaccinating elderly individuals. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Florida is known as a state where older, wealthier patients or people tend to go and live. And so their constituency is made up of, or the powerful constituency is made up of a lot of older, more wealthy individuals. And so their guidelines are a reflection of that. And so it's really kind of those two main factors that have resulted in things being much more chaotic and less prioritization. I think there has been a shift with the Biden administration, is mentioned, in that Biden has appointed a panel for COVID equity that includes a couple of academics, including one Yale professor who does a lot of work on health disparities. And they have tried to exercise a little bit more federal influence, and by evoking FEMA, which is the national emergency response that was evoked during Hurricanes Katrina. And so they're using federal resources to try to bolster federally qualified health centers, which are clinics that see indigent patient populations and trying to provide them with access to mobile vaccination strategies and those things. But it's really because there's been such a rush and people have low patience with nuance and complexity. And then the fact that some states, particularly more conservative states, tend to just ignore the federal recommendations and guidelines and do their own type of things.
Thank you. And there's been a question for Professor Marmot. So what do you believe is the first of the 5 giants that needs to be tackled?
What do I believe is the
first of the 5 giants that needs to be tackled?
I get asked that what's the one thing or the first thing all the time. And my response is, if I thought there was only one thing to do, I would have only made one recommendation. We have governments, we have healthcare systems that cut across the board. So yeah, I want to give high priority to early childhood and education, but I don't want to ignore older people. I want to give high priority to people who are languishing in care homes with inadequate care. So it's not one thing. We need to put equity of health and well-being at the heart of all government policy through the life course. And we need to do it all at once. We've laid out the recommendations. We know what the evidence shows, and we know where to act. And we'd like all the organs of government, national, local government, to be acting on them.
Thank you very much for that answer. That makes a lot of sense. And I really think everyone in the audience is really inspired by all of our speakers today. So on behalf of the Friends of MSF committee, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us and to the speakers for joining us today from different time zones in India and in the US. And again, I'm really sorry for the delay. But yeah, thank you very much for taking your time and sticking with us to the end.
Thank you for inviting us.